the second so beautiful.
You possibly might want to meet and talk with. Miss Doris Marion is here. She is a direct descendant of Job, who was Francis' brother. And she was here last year, and she's here again. We're delighted to have her. Miss Marion is sitting right in front of George. So if you would like to talk with her after the program, please do. We're very, very pleased to have you here. The next presenter is someone I have known for a long time again. You have read, again, I hope you have done your assignment. You have read about Karen's background. And here we've got another lawyer, for heaven's sakes. But the wonderful thing about Karen is that she thinks outside the box. And with that, please welcome Karen.
Thank you. It's always nice to be here in South Carolina with folks who have a similar interest to me with Francis Marion. The subject of my talk is images of Francis Marion. At the end, in 1780, all the news at the beginning of 1780 was bad for the American Revolution. There was disaster after disaster. The war had shifted to the South. And after Gates was defeated in August, the only good news coming out of the South were the reports of Francis Marion. These weren't big battles that he was involved in, but they were positive because he was winning them. Well, propaganda is propaganda. And when these reports got north to Congress, they started publishing them. And if you read the newspapers from Philadelphia from the middle of 1780 on, a dispatch from Francis Marion shows up in those reports almost once a week. And so by the end of the war, Francis Marion was a genuine hero to much of the United States, what would become the United States. By the end of the war, he had achieved almost Robin Hood-like status. People didn't particularly know what he looked like. They didn't know much about him. All they knew is he was able to beat up the British pretty good. And so quite early we get these romanticized thoughts of Francis Marion. And this picture here was done in 1865 by William D. Washington. And it's an image supposedly of Snow's Island. Washington lived between 1833 and 1879. He probably didn't know anybody who had ever been to Snow Island. That is Snow Island. The reality of Marion's campaigns were very bloody, very hard fought, very nasty. It's hard to point to any big victories he was involved in because he was fighting a war of attrition. He had figured out, as modern military thinkers have figured out, that big victories don't win wars necessarily. What wins wars is destroying the ability of the enemy to continue the fight, what Clausewitz called the enemy's center of gravity. Marion understood that if he could strangle the British supply lines, he could strangle the British, and that's what he set out to do. With a lot of small engagements, he made it almost impossible for the British to communicate with their troops in the interior, and he cut Cornwallis's supply lines, ultimately forcing Cornwallis to go to a little town called Yorktown to be resupplied by the British Navy. So he was very much a part of winning the American Revolution. And yet, because his role was not well understood, he's frequently only a footnote in major histories. In spite of that, in his own time, with people who knew what he did, they had the highest respect for Francis Marion. Arthur Williams, who was the adjutant for both Gates and Greene, said of Marion, nothing bad should ever be said of him. And although Williams wrote the account that is often quoted that when Marion showed up at Gates' camp, his appearance of him and his men were so burlesque that the soldiers were laughing at them, he then continued to say, the only reason he says that is to show what good account can come of somebody with a strong mind and a good heart when they put their mind to doing something, and that how great things were accomplished from somebody with a very small beginning. After the war, people wanted heroes. They wanted images of heroes. Francis Marion refused to have his portrait done. But because people wanted heroes, the booksellers didn't care. They did whatever drawings they wanted of Francis Marion. So we see this 1844 picture of Marion jumping the fence, which looks nothing like Marion. We see this 1844 print from William Gilmore Simms' biography of Marion, again a fanciful picture of Marion. Better pictures start to show up, like this one by William Rainey of Marion returning from a raid, very nice classical painting. Rainey lived between 1813 and 1857. He never met Marion. He may have known some of his men. This painting here, of course, is iconic, Marion crossing the PD, again done by William Rainey. Marion would be this figure here. This figure has been sometimes identified as Buddy. Marion's a body servant, but a body servant was the equivalent of a valet, a gentleman's gentleman. Marion's body servant would be not doing physical labor. That was not his job. His job was to take care of the general. And he probably would have been dressed just as well as the general, because if you're a servant, if you're a body servant, if you're a valet, if you're orderly, looked disreputable, that reflected poorly upon the master. So this gentleman here is not Buddy. This gentleman here obviously worked for the ferry owner, and in an earlier version of the same picture, William Rainey actually shows a white guy here as the ferry owner propelling the boat. These paintings are all done in the heroic tradition. This picture, next picture, is of Utah Springs. It was done by a fellow by the name of Alonzo Chappell. This would be Marion here on the dark horse, green on the white horse. Chappell also this very well-known picture of Marion jumping over a log. This fellow in the back would have been Buddy. Nice picture, close-up of Marion. Probably not a bad rendition of Marion. The problem is Chappell was born in 1828. He never saw Marion. So, who were the people who knew Marion, who could have given us a description? Well, obviously Peter Oree, Henry Lee, who served with him, William Galvin James, Alexander Garden, William Montreat, David Ramsey, and Arthur Williams, who I already talked about. William Montreat, in his autobiography of the war, only says of Marion he had a frame capable of enduring all hardships. Other than that, his only comment about Marion was that he remembers overhearing Lord Cornwallis often say that Marion was an excellent partisan officer. He'd give a great deal to have him taken. Not much of a physical description. Tarleton, in his memories, actually gives grudging respect to Marion when he says in his history of the Southern Campaign, and I quote, "Mr. Marion, by his zeal and abilities, showed himself capable of the trust committed to his charge," unquote. So we have people describing Marion's, not his physical appearance as much as the essence of him, his strength of mind and character. I'll read a number of descriptions of Marion. I think you've probably already heard some of them from time to time, but we'll go through them. In Oree's book with Weems, we really don't have a good description of Francis Marion in that book. Oree says that Marion had a naturally cheerful disposition, but he always wore a very somber expression. He describes Marion as having dark, poetic eyes. He said he liked a glass of brandy with supper, that he could be very formal with people if he wanted to keep that person in his place. And Oree relates the story of a lieutenant in the 2nd Regiment when Marion was a captain. Lieutenant takes off for town, parties, and then comes back to camp with this long, sad story of why he was not at camp when he's supposed to be. And Marion has said in front of all the other officers at the camp, said, "Oh, Lieutenant so-and-so, oh, you're back? I never even knew you were gone." And of course, all the officers laughed. "Ha ha ha, the captain never missed you, you were gone, worthless person that you are." And so the lieutenant was given the razz by everybody else, and one of the other officers said, "Ha ha, Lieutenant, so the captain has given you a set down." And the captain is said to reply, "A set down," replied he very angrily. "A set down, do you call it? I'd rather 1,000 times he had knocked me down, that ugly, cross, knock-kneed, hook-nosed son of a bitch." And that's as much of a description as Horry gives in Weems's book. Well, we know that Marion was of legitimate parentage because he was the last of 6 kids. Weems calls Marion ugly several times throughout his book, and when Mrs. Marion, the widow, the general's widow, read the account, she said she would horsewhip Weems if she'd get hold of him. So she disagreed with that description of her husband. I don't think Marion was ugly. I have a feeling that this rather upset lieutenant was referring to Marion's disposition, and Cross also referring to his disposition. I do think he was knock-kneed, though, and he probably was hook-nosed. Going on, probably the best description is from James. James was 16 years old when Marion took over the Williamsburg militia in 1790, and James describes Marion in this way. He was rather below the middle stature of men, lean and swarthy, his body well set, but his knees and ankles were badly formed, and he still limped upon one leg. As you remember the story, Marion had broken his ankle several months earlier and had been sent out of Charleston, which is why he was not captured there. And James continues, "He had a countenance remarkably steady. His nose was aquiline, his chin projecting, his forehead was large and high, and his eyes were black and piercing. He was now 48 years of age, but still, even at this age, his frame was capable of enduring fatigue and every privation necessary for a partisan. He was dressed in a close, round-bodied crimson jacket of a coarse texture and wore a leather cap, part of the uniform of the 2nd Regiment. The British were giving out red coarse cloth to anybody who would take the oath of allegiance. And this is what this red jacket was that Marion was wearing. Somewhere he had found somebody who had got this material from the British to make him a jacket. If you remember, he was with Gates in North Carolina, and he came back into South Carolina, crossing through the British lines to join the Williamsburg militia. He, in essence, was faking the enemy's uniform when he did this. If he had been captured, I'm sure they would have treated him as a spy at that point because he was wearing the red jacket. I don't think that was the uniform he normally wore. It was just his way of passing through an enemy-held territory without showing and being very conspicuous. By wearing the helmet of the 2nd Regiment, he could claim, well, my uniform coat wore out, and I got my uniform hat on, and that was maybe something that might help him a bit if he was caught, but I don't think it would have helped him much. Sims, who never knew Marion, William Gilmore Sims, spoke to a lot of people who knew Marion, who were still alive at the time Sims was writing. He quotes James for a description of Marion, but then he says, he continues on, he says, "But Marion, although a cheerful man, wore ordinarily a grave, sedate expression of countenance, never darkened by gloom. It was seldom usurped by mere merriment. He had no uproarious humor. His tastes were delicate, his habits gentle, his sensibilities warm and watchful. At most, a quiet smile lighted up his features, and he could deal in little gushes of humor, of which there was a precious fountain at the bottom of his heart. That he was capable of sharp sarcasm was also generally understood amongst his friends. Horry remarked that few men ever excelled him at the retort, but he was singularly considerate of the sensibilities of others, and had his temper under rare command. His powers of forbearance were remarkable. His demeanor, whether in triumph or despondency, was equally quiet and subdued." So here we have a guy who has his emotions very well under control, sort of a Mr. Spock, as it were, in terms of his having a very steady countenance, and yet under that, a man with a sense of humor, and not the moody, gloomy person that some people have portrayed him to be. I think that probably by the middle of the war, he was probably suffering a little bit of combat fatigue and understandably depressed, but that was not his natural state. Harry Lee, who served with Marion, under Marion, as a colonel, describes Marion twice in his book, his memoirs. He said that initially Marion was about 48 years of age, small in stature, hard in visage, healthy, abstemious, taciturn, enthusiastically wedded to the cause of liberty. Marion was a revolutionary. He believed in the cause. And in Weems's book, he talks about Marion talking to his officers, telling them how important the cause was. Enthusiastically wedded to the cause of liberty, he deeply deplored the condition of his beloved country. The Commonwealth was his sole object. Nothing selfish, nothing mercenary, soiled his Roman character. Fertile in stratagem, he struck unperceived, and retiring to those hidden retreats selected by himself in the morasses of the PD and Black River, he placed his corps not only out of reach of his foe, but often out of discovery of his friends. A rigid disciplinarian, he reduced to practice the justice of his heart, and during the difficult course of warfare through which he passed, rumor itself never charged him with violating the rights of persons, property, or humanity. Never avoiding danger, he never rashly sought it, and acting for all around him as he did for himself, he risked the lives of his troops only when necessary. Neither elated with prosperity nor depressed by adversity, he persevered with an equanimity which won the admiration of his friends and exacted the respect of his enemies. And a little later, Lee says that Marion was in stature of the smallest size, thin as well as low. His visage was not pleasing, his manners not captivating. He was reserved and silent, entering into conversation only when necessary, and then with modesty and good sense. He possessed a strong mind, improved by his own reflection and observation, not by books of travel. His dress was like his address, plain, regarding comfort and decency only. In his meals, he was abstemious, eating generally of one dish and drinking mostly water. He was sedulous and constant in the attentions to the duties of his station, to which every other consideration yielded. Even the charms of the fair, like the luxuries of the table and the allurements of wealth, seemed to be lost upon him. So we have a very strong character in Marion. And the last thing I will read is from Alexander Garden, who served with Lee and also with Marion in the legislature. And Garden doesn't really give us a physical description of Marion, but he does give us a little snippet of Marion's character. And Garden says of Marion, he was, when necessary, as secret as the grave, appeared generally thoughtful, and was approached by his officers with reverent awe. But when out of reach of the enemy, and at liberty to give indulgence to the natural cheerfulness of his disposition, he was familiar with his intimates and the gentlemen of his family. That would be his military staff, his family. Even to the point of playfulness. In private life, he was distinguished by the strictest integrity in all his dealings. He was the executor of several estates and guardian of many children. Every duty was performed to perfection. No man lived more beloved. None ever died more universally and justly lamented. So he was thought very highly of by his contemporaries, and yet again, he did not sit for a portrait. First time I read James, I had to run to the dictionary to find out what an aquiline nose was. It's not necessarily a big Roman nose, it's just a nose that goes like that at the tip. All right. So, we also heard that Marion was not handsome. Well, to understand what handsome is not, you have to know what handsome was. In the 18th century, John Lawrence, who was, almost all these pictures now were done by Charles Wilson Peale, John Lawrence was considered to be extremely handsome. Harry Lee was handsome. William Washington was handsome. You know, this guy, he was considered very handsome. And Charles Pinckney, Charles C., was also considered handsome. Well, if you notice, these were all kind of round, pudgy-looking guys. They weren't thin, swarthy guys. They didn't look like they were outdoorsmen. They looked like they never worked a day in their life, every one of them. Pinckney is interesting because he's wearing the uniform of the 2nd Regiment. He and Marion were both in the 2nd Regiment, and the difference is he was in the Grenadier Company, so he had this big bearskin cap. But other than that, up until the point Marion had a new uniform made in Georgetown after he became a brigadier general. If he wore a uniform coat, it would have looked like this one. Now, this is the picture most of us see of Francis Marion. And it showed up first in a book called National Portrait Gallery of Distinguished Americans, published in 1834. It was an engraving after a picture done by James V. Longacre, who is the fellow who developed the Golden Eagle coin for the U.S. Mint. And Longacre copied this after a picture by Thomas Stothard. Stothard was a very well-known English illustrator who lived from 1755 to 1834. Longacre was born in 1794. Longacre never knew Francis Marion. Stothard never left Great Britain, and Marion never went to Great Britain. So we have a picture after a picture after a picture done by a gentleman who never saw the original subject of the picture. Now, this picture really is kind of interesting for a number of reasons. First of all, we have these strange uniforms back here. So I look at this, when I first looked at this picture, and said, well, you know, this clearly can't be right because these guys here don't look like any Continental soldiers I ever saw, until I saw this guy, who is in the uniform of the Continental, Maryland line of the Continental Army. And you notice his hat, which is a round hat. Unfortunately, this picture is not that clear because this room is not that dark. But it's a round hat and it has a feather in it. And it is, in fact, this hat is the same hat as this, which means these are Maryland Continentals. And they are in accurate uniform. Marion is shown wearing a vest that's brocaded or embroidered, and in fact we know he owned an embroidered vest. It's a very unusual thing in a Continental officer, or any military officer on the American side, to see this type of a vest. The other thing we have is this really weird hat. I always thought it was really weird, until I figured out what it was. It's not a weird hat at all. It is a typical general officer's hat of the time period at an angle. And you can see in this picture by Trumbull, which you saw earlier, there's that hat, and it's at an angle. It is, in fact, that's what this hat is. And by Eutaw Springs, which Marion is shown at, he would have been to Georgetown, he would have got his new uniform coat, he would have had buff or white facings, as a general officer should have, and he would have his general officer's hat. The 2nd South Carolina hat had been shriveled up in half when it got burnt up in a fire, so that hat was long gone. The other thing is Marion's on foot, and that's what he probably would have been when he led the line at Eutaw Springs, because if he'd been riding a horse, he would have been marked by every British marksman in the British Army, because he would have stood out like a sore thumb. The proper way to lead would have been by foot. So this really has a lot to represent it, except for how on earth would Stothard have known what Marion looked like? A couple of possibilities. One is that John Trumbull, and Charles Wilson Peel and John Blake White, who were all Americans, who all had the possibility of seeing Marion, all studied under Benjamin West in London, and West would have known Stothard. So it's possible one of these artists gave them a sketch. Most of the pictures we see of Marion are rip-offs of the Longacre picture, and the dead giveaway is the stupid hat. All right, because you don't see this hat any other place but on the Marion portrait. And again, this is a little bit more inventive. They simply reverse the direction, but it's the same picture. And again, the giveaway is the hat. I always liked this picture of Marion. It showed up in a book, Washington as Generals, printed in 1855. It was attributed to Trumbull, who was a good artist. It kind of looks a little bit like Trumbull's work. The only problem is, when you read further in the Washington and his generals, the author says this is from a picture that Trumbull did of Utah Springs of Marion, and Marion had to be put in a more Pacific posture. That goes back to the Longacre picture, and on close examination, this is in fact the Longacre picture in a slightly different form. No way of telling whether this was the first picture or this is the second picture. More of I don't know whether this was done from Longacre's picture or Longacre's picture was done from this picture. No way of telling at this point in time. I could find no evidence that Trumbull ever did a picture of Utah Springs. So I think what we have is a copyright violation. So these are the two pictures. They are, if you notice the facing and everything, it's really the same picture. So now we get down, as I said, the three artists, Trumbull and Peel, were both Continental officers. The story is that at the end of the war, Marion refused to sit for a portrait, even although it would cost him no money. The person who probably was doing that was Charles W. Peel. He was, in 1782, he was in South Carolina doing portraits. In 1791, John Trumbull was in South Carolina doing portraits, so possibly either. But let's talk about John Blake White, sweet potato guy. White was born, this is the Perrier knives from 1870s, after White's picture. White was born in 1781, and the thing that's interesting about him, of course, is that he was the neighbor of Francis Marion. And Marion, at his death, John Blake White would have been 14. So he would have had a pretty good knowledge of Francis Marion. This is from the Apollo print, by the way. And S.A. Sally, who was a very noted historian in South Carolina, stated that Marion had agreed to pose for John Blake White, his youthful neighbor. I can see Marion doing that. I don't want my official portrait done. But this, the kid across the way wants to be a great artist, and I'm the famous guy, and he wants to do my picture. Oh, I'll tolerate him, I'll be nice with the kid, give him a break, I'll sit for him. And then Sally also says that supposedly all the images of Marion come from this, and every time you ever saw this, I thought, Marion looks very effeminate. It does not really seem to fit the verbal descriptions. And then coming up to this, I just decided, well, I should look at the original pictures, which we've seen, so I'll go over them kind of fast. This is, again, a close-up of the picture. We'll go back for a second. If we remember from the prior speaker, this gentleman was identified as Buddy. I don't think that's Buddy. I don't think that's Buddy because this man here is a field hand. Look at the way he's dressed. He's not a gentleman's gentleman. He's not the body servant of Francis Marion. He's a worker bee. I agree with the prior speaker. This is to a certain extent a fanciful picture. Her relative may well have served potatoes, but Buddy is in this picture. This is Buddy. Look at the symbolism. He's behind Marion's right shoulder. He's watching Marion's back. He's dressed as a gentleman. He's got the neck stock and everything on it. And look at the arm. It comes right around, all but embraces Marion. This is the guy who takes care of Francis Marion. This is Buddy, not the other guy. This is the U.S. Senate picture you saw before. Unfortunately, it needs desperately to be cleaned. It's very dark. It's hard to see. Of the four original Blake White pictures, this is the best one. I think this is the one that was done latest. The composition is the best. The use of light and dark is the best. Artistically, it's the best. West, light, dark, muddy colors. Benjamin West in London. So when we see this picture at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, it is the only picture that shows Marion in a green uniform, and it's got that more muddy color. All of these figures, I'll go back to this one for a minute, this is a much more masculine figure than in the print. This is, well, not as good as the other one. This print here is earlier, this original picture is earlier. The figure The figure, again, is more masculine, I think, than the prior one. In this particular picture, the development of the horse is quite well done. This is a very nice horse. It's a sorrel. He has a blaze. He has a stocking. These are specific marks of a horse. I believe this is a portrait of Ball. This is a very definite horse, and a very nice horse too, by the way. And this picture here, which is University of South Carolina, is the crudest of the four. From all of these pictures, we can tell a couple of things about Marion. First of all, he's a half head shorter than the British officer, and this is consistent throughout the four pictures. The only reason he looks like he's the same height is because of the stupid hat here he's wearing. There's a lot of stupid hats in the Marion pictures. All right. We can tell he has dark brown or black hair, and it's slightly curly. His ears are showing in all of the pictures. He has a little bit of a sideburn in all of the pictures. So we know that about him. In this picture, he's clearly knock-kneed. So yes, he's knock-kneed. In this picture, he has a very patronizing look. And I believe that this is not the look he would have had for the British officer. I think this is the look he had for the young 13 or 14-year-old artist that was trying to draw his picture, and he is kind of like the older guy saying, yeah, kid, go ahead. This picture may have been done while Marion was alive, and I'm going to tell you why in a minute. See the pistol here? Well, first of all, you see the sash. It's red. It's the right color for a general officer, right? Marion is wearing gaiters. He's not wearing boots. That makes sense to me. I broke my ankle. I can't get it into a boot. If Marion broke his ankle, which we think he did, he may not have been able to wear high boots after that, and he would have worn gaiters. Most officers in the Revolution are shown, as the British officer is, with boots. This guy's wearing gaiters. Unusual. The other thing is the pistol. I'm going to give you a close-up of that. See this pistol here? It does not have a rounded handle. It's kind of a squarish handle, if you notice that. And look at his coat. His coat is the right color of a Continental officer. General officers wear their coat, the tails along. They didn't fold the tails over like other folks did. And you have the row of buttons here. You have the row of buttons here. How is this coat secured? It's not straight across like a jacket of the British officer was, or like an 1812 jacket would be. It comes up here like this, and it comes up here like this. Have you ever had a jacket that you held closed by a belt and the buttons didn't reach? You're smiling. You know what I'm getting at. Marion had 10 years to fatten him up. I think this is his regular Continental Army coat that he's outgrown. When he poses for this picture, he can't get the stupid thing buttoned. So he folds it over, and he puts a belt around it, and he tells the 12, 13, 14-year-old Blake White, well, this is the way we always wore them. And of course, they didn't believe it. All right? So coming back here, you notice the pistol. This is Francis Marion's pistol that the South Carolina Historical Society has. And you notice the butt, which is not common in this era. It's squared off just like the one in the Blake White picture. In the Chicago History Museum picture, they also show the same squared off butt, and they show, in that picture of Blake White's with Marion, it shows a metal cap at the base of the pistol, and that's what this pistol has. You can't see it too well in this picture, but it has a metal cap on the butt pistol. In addition to the body type, which is normal, he's not misformed, he's normal proportions, and the hair color, we can also tell his height. How do we do that? Now, I'm sorry to show you a picture of a nude man and woman. This is right out of an art book. Artists know that to have a properly proportioned figure, a male figure, you use the head as your standard of measurement. And the average of a common male is 7.5 heads tall. If you are an artist and you want your figure to look heroic, you make him 8 heads tall. Right. In the U.S. Senate picture And in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts picture, the British officer is shown in the Senate picture as being 7.5 heads. In the Boston Museum of Fine Arts picture, 8 heads. Marion is shown as 8 heads, 8 heads. Marion picture, these two pictures are done according to classical painting standards. White had been to Benjamin West and been told a figure has to be 7.5 to 8 heads. All right. At that rate, considering the average height, and we're going to assume the British officer's average height was 5'6" to 5'8", that makes Marion someplace between 5'1" and 5'3.5" inches tall. Okay. If we go to the University of South Carolina picture and the Chicago History Museum picture, Marion is 6.5 heads, the British officer is 6.5 heads. Marion 6 heads, the British officer 6.5 heads. We still come up with the same approximate heights, but the interesting thing is this, that John Blake White went to study with Benjamin West in 1799. He came back in 1803. First thing Benjamin West would have taught him is the rule of heads. These pictures were done prior to 1799.